Hi there, I'm Dr. Sam Hazledine, as I would hope you know, founder of MedWorld. Today I am interviewing Dr. Charlotte Chambers. Now, Charlotte is the principal analyst at the Association of Salaried Medical Specialists and has conducted some really interesting research into burnout and particularly into gender bias in medicine and how that relates to burnout, which we are going to discuss today. Charlotte's been doing this for a long time. We were just discussing that soon they'll be releasing some updated work on burnout, a 5-year sort of follow-up study. So has really been in this space for a long time. So has a wealth of knowledge, and we're lucky to be talking to you today. So welcome, Charlotte. Good to have you here on this live stream.
Kia ora, Sam. Thank you for the invite.
My pleasure. Look, it's important work, so I'm glad we're getting to explore it a bit. So I guess before we go into talking about gender bias, actually, obviously you're an expert in burnout in doctors as well. What got you interested in this work?
I wouldn't say I'm an expert yet, but I sort of stumbled across it in the work that I've been doing for the ASMS, broadly looking at indicators of well-being in the specialist medical workforce here in New Zealand. And we ran the first nationwide survey of burnout levels in senior medical professionals 5 years ago now, back in 2015, using the Copenhagen Burnout Inventory. And it turned out that this is the first time that a nationwide study had been performed using that particular tool. So we had it published in the BMJ Open. It continues to get a lot of sort of citations. And I think it was important work in terms of setting the discourse around burnout as a particular indicator of well-being for New Zealand doctors especially.
And how did that burnout compare to burnout internationally?
So at the time we found that just over half of those who'd responded to the survey were scoring as being likely to be experiencing burnout. And that seemed to be fairly, from memory, a little bit higher than comparable studies looking at different occupational groups. And it certainly was in line with other research that's been far more widely cited using the Maslach Burnout Inventory. I know Shanafelt and his crew at the Mayo Clinic have been doing a lot of work in that space. So there is that general acknowledgement that doctors do have higher rates of burnout when compared with the general public. And I think our research from memory certainly followed that pattern.
I know that it's been around for a long time, the research, but it never ceases to amaze me that 1 in 2 doctors are experiencing burnout. It's just such a high number, but you'd never know it from a group of doctors. We're so good at hiding it.
And I think there's also a degree of being able to recognise it as well, in that sense that certain behaviours do become normalised. And I think it's only at that point where you either hit the point of no return and either bail out of medicine or have a significant, perhaps a subsequent event, which I'm sure you'll know far more about in being a doctor than I do, that's the point at which it gets recognised. But what the survey seemed to suggest is that there are many, 1 in 2 doctors in New Zealand who are regularly working with high levels of fatigue, exhaustion, and that certainly, it resonated with the other work that we've done as well, looking at the rates at which doctors will routinely work through illness, which we've termed presenteeism, and also is another lens, if you like, on why bullying is a problem as well. I think, again, it's a sort of normalisation of perhaps ways of working or ways of feeling when you're at work that actually probably shouldn't be normalised and may not be acceptable in other workplaces either.
I mean, that normalization is a really interesting piece, isn't it? Because when something is so sort of endemic through a population of doctors, we just grow to accept that this is how it is, this is how it has been, this is how it was for me, and therefore this is how it's going to be for you. At the moment. I mean, and it's also, I think that you spoke to it is so difficult to identify in yourself as well. I know that when I've been doing this sort of research and been in the space around burnout and well-being for 6 or 7 years now. And I remember, about 5 years ago, and I've been doing a lot of work in the burnout space, and I was feeling a bit tired, and I was just feeling a bit, disengaged, and just, here I am actually spending a lot of time in the burnout space. And at one point I thought, oh, look, I'll just do one of these burnout quizzes and see what it showed. And it showed that I was in, severe burnout. And for someone who's researching in the space to still not be able to see it in myself, it really gave me an appreciation of just how hard it is. And I think particularly because of that normalization, because we see it as, par for the course, if 1 and 2 are feeling like this, then why should I be any different?
Yep. And so this is the other particular interest that I have, is looking more broadly at aspects of the culture of medicine that I think are really disabling in many ways. And in particular we know that we've got clinical creep, so we know that there are growing workload pressures. But if you combine that with an expectation that medicine, along with many other professions, I think it's fair to say, that it is a job that you're supposed to give, in many ways, your life to. It is supposed to dominate both in terms of time, and I'm sure you can speak to how long it takes to actually become a doctor. Then it's kind of like a perfect storm as well, in that it is, at a certain level, I think, expected that you're supposed to work crazy hours. It's expected that you're supposed to be fatigued. But actually, how sustainable is that in the long run? And so this is where I started to do some qualitative research around, I guess, what is it that is leading to these statistics? Because the other aspect of that first study was there was a clear disparity in terms of burnout rates by gender and age. And I was really worried that there was, basically, it was like 2 parallel lines tracking along across the age groups, where women across all age groups had statistically significant higher rates of burnout than their male counterparts. And this really peaked for the specialists in their younger ages, so the 30s and their 40s. And I think from that first study, it was 71% of women in their 30s who'd responded were scoring as being likely to have very high levels of burnout.
Wow. So that's what prompted this qualitative research that you've done. And I'd like to get to that, but you're speaking to the culture of medicine.
Yes.
And I think an interesting thing about this burnout, and, it was, I think, over 3 years ago that, we lobbied the World Medical Association. We amended the Declaration of Geneva, put in their, value set of doctors worldwide as I'll look after myself. But, I'm certainly not seeing it getting any better. And so, I guess, there's research to show that it isn't. There's also just qualitative experience that seems to demonstrate that it isn't. And I know you're going to be publishing some work soon, but why do you think that? There's obviously a much bigger focus than there was. Burnout wasn't something we talked about when I was at medical school 20 years ago, but there's a much bigger focus. At the highest level, the World Medical Association has said, yes, it's important. Doctors have to look after themselves. Why do you think it's not changing?
Big question. I think the problem's multifaceted to begin with. And I think that because of that, you have to kind of have a more nuanced understanding. I guess, I'm coming from the union, right? So I work for the union that represents senior doctors and dentists around New Zealand. So we would clearly see an issue with the expectations in terms of the workloads that doctors are facing. And we also think that there's a fairly significant problem with how stretched and how lean the system is. And we've been doing surveys of clinical directors working in different services around the country. And there's a consistent reporting of short staffing in their services, which I think is a big part of the problem. On average, it's almost a 25% staffing shortfall around the country at that specialist level. You combine that with shortages in other staffing groups as well that make up the medical workforce, broadly speaking, and it's a real problem. And I think if you combine that with I guess what I would broadly term the more, I suppose, aspects of the culture of medicine that are problematic, this expectation that it's normal to work long hours, it's normal to deal with fatigue, then I think it, as I said before, it can lead to this perfect storm, which burnout is a lens on it, if you like. It's just one particular view. And I think I think the discourse around burnout has gained purchase, if you like, in the public arena. It's certainly a focus now, but again, it is. I think we have to see it as an indicator or a lens on wellbeing issues more broadly. I also don't think it's unsurprising in many ways that when you're at that point of experiencing burnout, as you found yourself, that you're unable to recognise it, because I think you're obviously a driven professional. There is an expectation that you just keep pushing through, you keep working harder, and that's what's expected of you almost.
Yeah. I
think where the gender lens can be quite helpful in terms of adding another dimension to this. I was reading a paper today that Tate Shanafelt put out last year, looking at why burnout has become normalised, if you like, as a behavioural response in some regards. I think that's how he framed it. It's partly because I think doctors are inculcated to work as if they are a part of the superhero mentality, which is not a criticism against doctors, but it's the way in which you're kind of expected to train. It's the characteristics that are fostered in you, the perfectionist tendencies, all that type of stuff. It does tend to add to the likelihood that you will experience burnout, I think, in many ways. I think the gender lens adds another dimension to it when you think about medicine as having values and cultures which are inherently gendered. And I think that might be partly why women working in medicine today are experiencing a qualitatively different set of experiences to their male counterparts.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
And we will get into that. It's interesting. I mean, I sort of thinking about burnout, and I sort of created how would you approach burnout? And I mean, at the base of it all, though, is full staffing. If you're running at 25%, you forget about all the, mindfulness and you can do this, you can do that. It's like, that's just a Band-Aid to you've actually got to have enough staff, don't you? What's driving that? What's driving 25% of not enough specialists in the country?
Well, I mean, we know that that health has been underfunded for a long time. I mean, we've just had the health review come out, which I don't think really gave us any answers to that question. They acknowledged it, which is a starting point.
Yeah.
But the sense that you have to work differently and you have to perhaps think about staffing services differently is a little bit of a sidestep, I think, of the real issue. We also know that there's massive unmet need in New Zealand, and significant amounts of the Māori and Pacifica populations are missing out on treatment. So I don't think you can deny that we need to put more money into health, that we need to fund more positions, because there's certainly the need for it, and those who are currently working in the system are suffering. So you have to take a nuanced and multifaceted approach to the solution to this problem.
Yeah, and a fresh lens on it, isn't it? I mean, a lot of times, I was thinking about this the other day, businesses or organizations or systems evolve. But the problem with evolution was a great system for plants and animals, because we have had 13.8 odd billion years. But the problem with evolution is evolution works through mistakes, not through successes. And so, something like a system, it needs step change, it needs innovation. Evolution will just continue to grind away slowly and not provide the change we really need, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have my own personal views around how certain things could be done differently. It's not my area of expertise. I have an academic background, so I have to be careful with what I say. But, there's so many parallels with the problems that I see in medicine with my own background in academia, with some of my friends who work in law and in architecture. In many ways, the problems aren't particular to medicine. I think it is something to do with the manner in which professions have evolved over time.
Sure.
Coming back to medicine specifically, I reckon there's huge scope for us to be more creative in terms of how doctors are trained, if you like. We know it takes a hell of a long time to create a doctor. I'm certainly not suggesting that needs to change, but, is it time to rethink things like the apprenticeship model, for example? Is it time that we start thinking outside of the square in terms of how many part-time training or fellowship positions are on offer? One of the women who I interviewed as part of my qualitative study talked about her very serendipitous opportunities that she was offered to do part-time training in surgery. And she found that was hugely beneficial. She wouldn't change it. And she's actually recommending that as a pathway for more and more young aspiring surgeons coming through.
Yeah, right.
And you see the rise of other, organisations who are really pushing back against perhaps changes to hours around training and working and that type of thing. So I think we don't necessarily have to rely on the way that it's always been done. My father-in-law is a retired ophthalmologist, and I asked him about how he found his training periods and working as a house surgeon and so on. He said it was bloody awful. He said, I didn't learn a damn thing. He said he was so knackered the whole time. He said he just sort of trotted it out and worked a bit like a zombie. So, that was a long time ago now. He's in his 80s. And yet we still seem to be replicating the way in which it's always been done.
Yeah.
Maybe it's time to change.
Yeah,
not my area of expertise, but I certainly
but fair enough. And I'm sure a lot of doctors listening, and a lot of we've been through that. The junior doctor years. You're chasing blood. You're doing a lot of things that aren't really expanding your medical knowledge. So you're probably right. But let's talk about this gender and bias in medicine. 3/4 of women in their 30s, being burnt out. Half of doctors being burnt out. The numbers are huge both ways.
Yep.
But particularly, obviously, in women, obviously that prompted you to do this qualitative research. So can you describe your research, and let's talk about what you found?
Sure. So when we first took the burnout statistics around the district health boards, the question that we were always asked is, well, why? And we didn't really know why. We knew some of the parts of the puzzle, the short staffing, all that kind of stuff, but we didn't really know what was going on in terms of the lived experiences of doctors in this particular age cohort. So my background is in qualitative research, so it was a natural, pathway for me to go out and talk to these women. And in the end, I spoke with 14 women from around the country working in a range of different specialties, including surgical specialties. They self-nominated to participate in the research. Some of them were motivated by the realization that they were perhaps on the cusp of burnout. Others were just awesome, generous women who wanted to help out with a really good research project. So thank you to all of those women who helped out. I found the interviews fascinating. They were incredibly long. They were very in-depth. Some of them lasted for up to 3 hours.
Wow.
And they weren't your kind of standard list of questions, let's run through them. They were more like conversations, semi-structured interviews. And we touched on a huge range of subjects, from why did they choose their specialty, how do they feel about their work-life balance, would they recommend medicine to a younger version of themselves. So a real wide range of topics we touched upon. But what I found as I was going around talking to these women were common themes. And so the final analysis that I undertook was to really explore what are the commonalities of experience that these women have expressed. How do they relate both to broader indicators around well-being and the sustainability of medicine as a profession, and what can we learn from their experiences in terms of, coming up with suggestions for change. And I think I would love to complement this study with interviewing younger male doctors as well, because my gut feeling is that many of the things that they described are particular to the gender and the gender norms around being a woman in medicine today, and how medicine has evolved as a very gendered profession. But, in 2025, so only in 5 years' time, the Medical Council of New Zealand estimates that we will have more women in medicine than men, at least coming out of medical schools. So, these questions around what it's like to work as a woman in medicine today are very pertinent, and
Absolutely.
I think they're worthy of exploration, not only in the least because they might shed a light on burnout and the statistics behind burnout and presenteeism and so on, but these broader questions around the sustainability of medicine as a profession, and how we can try and make our district health boards around the country the employers of choice for many doctors who have chosen this arduous career, and I don't think have gone into it lightly. So we really need to think about how we can improve things for doctors, especially by the time they reach a specialist rank in the medical system, because it takes a long time to get there.
Yeah, it's a big commitment. So what did you find?
Well, I ended up distilling it down into kind of three overlapping themes. One of the things that women often talked about was this notion of work-life balance. And everybody's talking about work-life balance, whether you're a bloke or a Sheila, we all juggle, whether it be our domestic commitments alongside our work commitments or our passions outside of medicine. So what are some of the peculiarities around that juggle that these women have faced? And in this vein, I was really interested to explore, I guess, some of the history around medicine. And this led me into the second theme, which was some of the assumptions around time and norms around time. And I've already talked about how it takes a very long time to become a doctor, but there's also key assumptions around doing your time and proving your competence through having done your time, which is firmly embedded in the way in which doctors are trained and the way in which doctors are expected to work. It's not uncommon, I think you would agree, that you're expected to regularly and routinely work above and beyond your allocated hours of work. Patients don't adhere to a 9-to-5 work schedule, we know that. But what aspects of the culture of medicine contribute to these manners of working that can be really detrimental to looking after yourself, to finding time to care for yourself, and indeed, as many of these women were finding, to enable them to perform that juggle between the work and their other domestic commitments. So my background's in geography, and so I'm particularly interested in boundaries, how we create boundaries between the different spheres of our existence. And we've already talked about how in medicine it's expected in many ways not just to be a job, it's a vocation, it's something that becomes your life, it's a core aspect to your identity. So there's a very different type of boundary around medicine in terms of it bleeding into many different facets of your life. You identify quite clearly as a doctor. It's expected that work, in turn, you bring your work home with you quite often. It's expected that you'll catch up with your administrative duties at home in your own personal time. Many of the women spoke about frustrations with not having enough time to do things like keep up with current literature, to do their preparation for the next day's surgeries, that type of stuff. If they have significant other domestic commitments, if they are really tied up in this juggle of work and life, then finding time can be even more problematic. So those were two kind of intertwined themes that I really focused on.
Yep.
And underpinning a lot of that were the significance of broader gender norms. The fact that the women were routinely mistaken as, or misidentified by patients as the nurse, or when they're conducting ward rounds as the specialist, patients would direct questions to the lone male medical student in their group. What is the broader significance of those minor acts of misidentification? How over time can they coalesce to make women have to kind of work harder to assert themselves as the legitimate medical professional? What does it mean if you're routinely getting misidentified or treated differently by your staff? Another anecdote that I had shared with me was one woman who was a surgeon who, over a significant period of time, was always provided with the wrong equipment by her nursing staff. And she would ask them very politely to get the correct equipment. But it wasn't until she lost her temper one day, slammed her fist down and swore at the nursing staff, and in many ways acted like a surgeon, that her request was adhered to. And so there's some very interesting things around the interplay of gender schemas, gender norms, what people expect a doctor to look like, and how that in turn can also feed into the need to work harder to assert yourself as legitimate in that space. I've also been interested, a lot of the women, but not all of them, had children. And, perhaps some of the listeners to this podcast and those who've read my research might think, well, of course, women in their 30s are going to have a high rate of burnout. It kind of makes sense. It's that perfect storm age where you're transitioning from a registrar to a consultant. You might also be thinking about starting a family. But the thing I always came back to was, well, their male counterparts would also be experiencing the same issues. So what is it about the things that those women are experiencing that make it such a qualitatively different experience? So the research in many ways was not just a reflection around what women were doing, or perhaps what women could do differently, But in many ways, it was looking at, well, what are their male counterparts not doing, or what can work as a broader thing be doing differently.
So what were the main differences between the male counterparts and the female doctors in that age group, and how did that help to protect the males, I guess, to some extent?
I think the women who I spoke with, especially those who had domestic commitments and mainly children, I think they detailed that sense of responsibility for it in ways that I don't think they felt that either their male partners or their male colleagues really felt.
Yeah.
And I think this isn't insignificant. I was doing some research around the rise of professions, and they are clearly gendered. The rise of a profession, including medicine, has a clearly gendered history, and that it was enabled to happen because there was always somebody at home taking care of the unpaid labour and performing that unpaid labour. So professional work has arisen, if you like, based on the fact that you can only dedicate yourself in that way, both temporally and I guess intellectually, if you know that somebody else is also taking care of those other responsibilities. Yeah. You have women who are still seen, by and large, we still operate in accord with these really subtle and yet powerful gender schemas, which still see women as having a sense of responsibility for the domestic sphere. Obviously, if we have children, then there are certain biological realities which mean that we are more heavily invested or more significantly affected by having kids. But, it's a really interesting field, and I think part of the purpose or the significance of the work that I was trying to put out there was just to make people think about these things.
Yeah.
I'm particularly concerned about the way in which we describe the growing numbers of women in medicine as the feminization of medicine. It's a very simple linguistic slip, but it's actually a pejorative description if you think about it. Because to suggest that medicine's never been gendered and it's only now becoming gendered that we have growing numbers of women in it is not necessarily an accurate representation in my view.
No, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? And I sort of thought about this burnout as well. My grandfather was a doctor. The family, the GP, back when GPs did a bit of surgery and a bit of anesthetics, and he delivered babies, and he was on 24 hours a day potentially. But that's exactly what he had. He had a wife. He had 5 kids, but he had a wife who was full-time mum. And he would come home from work, and the kids knew that he would go to his study and he'd do some reading and have a cigar. And, it was a very different world to what we have now. Probably for male and female doctors. I don't know many male doctors who get to go home and have a cigar and sit in their study either. But for women, do you think there's a stronger identity potentially as for a woman for a mother compared to a father? Do you think the males, if they primarily said, "Who are you?" would they say, "I'm a doctor, I'm a surgeon"? Is a woman less likely to put? Would she say, "Look, I'm a doctor and a mother"? I mean, is there a sort of an identity piece there that means you go, "I'm going to be dropping the ball on something," and it's harder if you feel like you're dropping the ball on everything?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and some of the women who I spoke to who were mothers as well, certainly they would flex their primary identity depending on who they were talking to. So I think if they were out at their playgroup, they wouldn't really want to be seen as a doctor, probably because they'd get all the other mothers asking them, "Well, what's this rash on little one's bottom?" All that kind of stuff.
And we all know as doctors that rashes is just impossible. No one knows.
But I think on the flip side, there was a real strong sense that these women had to police their identities as mothers when they returned to paid work. And one woman had this great line where she said, "When I go to work at the start of the day, I have to leave all that other stuff at the door. The expectation is clear. As a doctor, you don't bring your life to work. You put on your professional demeanor. You come in as a doctor. No one cares if you've got children at home who are, unwell or struggling or whatever. You have to leave that behind." And another woman who I spoke with talked about how she actively policed herself not to talk about the fact that she had a newborn baby at home because she didn't want to be misread as somehow unprofessional or less committed as a consequence of that. She really had that sense that it could be used against her. So there is a lot of active boundary making practices in play, and I'm particularly interested, as I said before, about how work is expected to bleed into your personal life, and yet your personal life is not expected to bleed into your professional world. You really have to, it's a one-way boundary.
It's interesting, isn't it?
I think, your point about do men feel the same? Well, I think the new generation coming through probably do. I had a couple of younger men when I was giving earlier presentations around this, talk to me about their attempts to facilitate what they thought was required to have more involvement in their children's life and to have a better work-life balance. And one of the ways that they'd sought to do this was to request a reduction in their FTE, the hours worked. Yeah. And there was significant pushback to that request. And I think this is, again, where some of the structural issues are coming into play. We know that they're short-staffed. It's hard to take leave. It's hard to reduce your hours because there's no one else there to pick up the workload. So you can see how it is very much an interplay with the cultural and the structural factors.
And it's somewhat a self-perpetuating problem, isn't it?
I think so. But I actually feel quite hopeful about the new generation coming through. We give millennials a lot of shit, really, but I think in some ways the fact that they are willing to say, actually, I want to have a life, I do want to do medicine, but I also want to have interests and activities outside of my profession that will sustain me in the long run is a really helpful thing. And also, I think we have to start questioning the full-time work model as well. How sustainable is it?
Yeah.
I know that there's a lot of debates around continuity of care, but surely, coming back to your challenge before, do we need to be more creative? Do we need to think outside of the box? Well, I think we surely can fix issues around continuity of care in ways that will, at the end, benefit the patient and the quality of care that they receive. You don't have to just have that sense that everything is resting on your shoulders, I think.
It's interesting you say hope, because I feel the same way in terms of, you speak to younger generations of you speak to medical students, speak to the junior doctors, and they do see things differently. My prediction is, though, that burnout's going to get worse before it gets better, because the problem we have is so say, for example, we go back to a young parent, male or female, and we had this big gap between, women 75% burnout compared to men at 50, which is still incredibly high. The problem we have is that the new generation is potentially of men are going to feel the same way as the women, going, I really am dropping the ball on being a dad. And so burnout is going to get worse before it gets better, because we have another generation coming through with a different set of expectations, but a system that doesn't meet those expectations. But then why I feel that it will then get better is that generation will be the one that drives change. So the next generation may be coming to a better system. And, when I talk about burnout, I go and speak, I used to, when we were allowed to, but go and speak at conferences to doctors, and there's this real sense, with these, younger, and I say, younger sort of 30s, 40s doctors going, we need to change this. And there's also the sense of duty, I believe, in this generation that goes, we can leave this better than we found it. And so I think while it's a challenging time, and while, it's probably going to get darker before it gets lighter, I do think we're going to be we're moving in the right direction.
And the research that I did detailed a lot of really miserable experiences that these women had gone through. But equally, there were some real glimmers of hope in their stories. And I'm thinking in particular about those who had been incredibly well supported by both their colleagues and in particular amazing clinical directors that they'd worked with over time, who really went that extra mile in terms of supporting them through various pinch points, I guess, in their career. And the feeling that these women had was that had made all the difference to whether they stayed or left. And so I don't think you can underestimate the importance of perhaps the kind word, I see behind you, be kind always. It is so important to foster collegial ways of speaking, treating each other as people who do have lives and commitments, and in many instances might have a hell of a lot of stuff going on outside of work as well. We have to see each other as people, not just as automatons working in a big system. And I spoke to a group of psychiatrists the other evening about their experiences, and there were some young PGY1s in the audience as well, and they were really eager to talk to me about how they were perceiving things going through. One of them in particular talked about an argument that she'd had recently with a younger male student colleague who said, this gender pay gap stuff is a load of bollocks. It's just because women don't work hard, or they choose specialties that are more poorly remunerated. And I was quite surprised at that, and she was very frustrated, and she said, well, how would you push back against that? And I think, again, this is where paying attention to the role of gender bias and how subtle it is a really important step. You actually have to start recognizing that bias in many different ways, be it racial or gender based, is there, and it will shape how we view things. And
understanding we all have it. That's
Exactly.
the thing. I sort of, we're looking. There's a lot, with Black Lives Matter, for example, at the moment. I wouldn't say I'm racist, but I know I have racial biases.
We all do. As you say, everybody has it. Take the Harvard implicit bias test. It's incredibly confronting. But once you recognize that you have bias, then there are additional steps to do things about it. And it's very well
shining the light is step one. That's right.
Yes.
And then you can consciously act rather than subconsciously, I guess.
Exactly. And, I can't emphasize enough the importance of actually making the implicit conscious in so many ways. There was a fascinating paper that I read recently which found that people who do not believe that there are problems with gender bias, and particularly around things like gender pay gaps and so forth, are more likely to have significant levels of gender bias themselves, and secondly, are more likely to act upon that gender bias in ways that perpetuates the problem. So there's a very, very good study recently published at the beginning of this year, which looked at gender bias in veterinary science, which again, similar to medicine, is a formerly male-dominated profession that's becoming increasingly feminized, to use that pejorative term. But despite, the growing or the gender balancing of the profession, problems with gender pay gaps, lack of women in leadership positions persist, and it's precisely due to this problem. People are not willing to recognise the fact that they have an issue with gender bias, and that bias can influence their subsequent actions around employment practices and advancement opportunities.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember before I became a parent, I read, or when we young kids, and I remember reading something going, the good parents don't think they're good parents. The people who think they're great parents generally aren't. Yeah. And so, if you just don't observe that there's issues, you're just going to blindly carry on. But if you actually think, oh, jeepers, maybe I'm not so good in this space, actually that's the first step to becoming good in that space.
Yeah.
So
there was just one other thing I wanted to talk about just briefly. I don't know how much time we've got, but
we're good.
It's the prospect of part-time work. And so in the UK and the NHS, and increasingly in Australia, I'm sure you might be aware of that O&G specialist who said that, the growing number of women entering into medicine is putting the profession at risk. It's been described in the UK as a ticking time bomb. And, I think it's really important that we actually stop and think about this. What are the assumptions going on here? And this comes back to the emphasis that I had in my research on time and norms around time. A lot of the women who I interviewed were working less than full time, not because they had private work, but because they were picking up unpaid work, or simply because they felt that they needed to work fewer hours just to kind of cope with the rigors of work. I think actually we need to start questioning how we can foster more part-time opportunities or less than full-time opportunities, and normalize that as a really legitimate way of working in medicine. And arguably in many other professions too, because I think until we do so, it's not going to be seen as a legitimate way of working. Yet the benefits from working less than full-time are huge. I'm thinking of, there's been quite a lot of research out there which suggests that the clinical outcomes of patients who are seen by doctors who are working less than full-time are often better because they're given more attention, or the doctor has more time or energy to commit to their patient. And that came out strongly in some of the interviews that I conducted as well. But I think perhaps the most concerning factor is we know that burnout is precipitated by working very, very long hours. In the study that I conducted originally, there was a strong correlation between not having a break of, I think it was less than 10 hours between work, and having worked more than 24 hours in a single period, and working really long hours, with your likelihood to be experiencing burnout. The point here is many of the women who are working less than full-time actually denigrated themselves for that way of working. They described themselves as feeling like a bit of a slacker, or feeling like they weren't being treated as a real doctor because of their decisions to work less than full-time. So you can kind of see that tension in a way. We know that working fewer hours is protective, but if that's not also accompanied by a cultural shift which encourages and supports different ways of working, then it's not actually going to be a protective strategy. So that's certainly something that I think could be addressed.
Well, I mean, anyone listening or watching, I guess if your immediate gut reaction is kind of bullshit, let's just work harder, maybe that's the sign to go, actually, maybe I'm part of the problem. Maybe I could start to, particularly if you're in leadership, clinical directors have such an influence over their department. I mean, culture is very much set from the top. So, being, and I hear similar sort of stories, people often, women job sharing, surgeons, and they're just good doctors because they're engaged. They don't feel like they're not doing their parent. They're doing a good job of being a parent, good job being a doctor. But it takes a clinical director to go, that's a great idea, let's do that.
And similarly, for that to be offered as an option for the young men coming through too.
Sure, no, exactly. It's not just the women.
Yes, and I think if that was normalised as your wife's about to give a baby, well, let's think about how we can tweak your FTE for the next wee while, or give you some flexible working options, then that would make a huge difference, I suspect.
But to help with that, to your original point, we need funding because we need more doctors, don't we?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so on that note, we are
about these ideas. Sorry, what was that?
Oh, sorry, Sam. I was just going to say we are about to put out a pre-election special in our specialist magazine that the ASMS produces, where we go through the various health policies of the political parties, looking at some of these key issues. So
right.
If you're undecided as to how you're going to vote, then certainly have a look at that if you need.
Right. Well, and I'll make sure if you can share a link with me, we'll make sure we share that through our channels as well, because actually having someone else who has the time to go through it. You guys do, so we'll just read what you say. We've
done the hard work, so that's what we're here for.
That's exactly what we need. Hey, I found this incredibly interesting, and I think to some point, to that point of there's some confronting things as well, and you start to sometimes you notice your own reaction, and you're like, oh, that's just part of the same old problem of that culture. So I found it really really interesting. Is there anything else? Where do we go from here? I mean, how do you think we best navigate this? I mean, there's research, there's conversations like this that just shine the light. Where do we need to go? How do we make this better?
Well, again, I come back to my first point. It's a multifaceted problem, so it's going to require many different solutions. I think, the work that we continue to do as the Union for Senior Doctors and Dentists, in terms of pushing these arguments at management of our district health boards and many other employers around the country, is really important. We have to have more flex in the system. There needs to be more bums on seats to enable different ways of working. It's a really important point. But alongside that, there also has to be those debates within the colleges as well. How can they tweak their training pathways to make things easier? Or do they allow the same opportunities? Is it fair? How can things be improved at that level as well? So everybody has to feel that they've got skin in the game in these debates, because there's no silver bullet, if you like. It goes right back to the education, the role colleges have in terms of the professional training, some of the norms, the cultural norms that are perpetuated through their part of the process as well. And then it comes to the employer. What can they be doing in terms of shifting the culture, putting less pressure on departments to work short-staffed, to deal with clinical creep? But I certainly think in terms of the work that individual doctors can do, sure, you can do your mindfulness course, but I actually think doing some of the work around having those discussions within a department about, what can we do to perhaps support the younger generation coming through? How can we really wrap support around people who might be going through key transition moments? Those are really important things to consider too. I'm just reflecting on my own experience in academia. When I was a junior academic coming out of my PhD and getting my first academic post, the thing that made the biggest difference to me were having mentors, having more experienced seniors who'd been through the system to back me, or to feel that I could discuss issues and questions with them and come up with different ways to navigate problems as I encountered them. There are some amazing mentoring programs out there. I'm thinking about Juliet Rumble-Smith's Wahine Connect. So if you are able to act as a mentor, don't underestimate the value of it, but make sure that you're encouraging them to work in a good and sustainable way, not just perpetuate the way in which it's always been done as the only option.
Well, interesting. Interesting answer there, because as you say, it's multifaceted. There's no one answer, and on one hand you could say, well, that's problematic, but on the other hand, it means we can all play our part. Whether you're the medical student, the junior doctor, the registrar, the specialist, the clinical director, you're in policy, you're hiring, whatever it is, execs in the hospitals, we can all do our bit. And actually, if we all have that, I guess, commitment to that end outcome, which is we need to do better, then we just start where we are, I guess. We start where we are with what we can do and what we can influence. And the more of us who are doing that, the more of us who are having these conversations, the more of us who are taking little actions every day, that's how you shift a culture.
It is. And, if you want to reason why it matters, the evidence again suggests that patient care benefits when staff are working in environments where they feel that they are supported, that they feel that they are, it's a nice place to work. You can't underestimate the kind of broader significance of that. So you should be kind to colleagues and don't underestimate the importance of inquiring, well, how are you? How's everything going outside of work? But equally, you need the time to have that type of discussion too.
We as doctors sign up for that. First, do no harm, and it starts with us. So if we apply that to ourselves and our colleagues in our departments, our hospitals, we'll move it in a better direction. Yeah,
good note to end on.
Awesome. Great note to end on, exactly. Well, look, thank you so much. I really enjoyed this. I've really enjoyed sort of understanding some of the work you've done, some of the insights you gained, and some of the conclusions you came to. So, look, we'll look forward to sharing your analysis of the various policies. But look, really appreciate your time, and I'm sure anyone listening or watching has enjoyed it too. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Sam.
You have a great day, and anyone listening, watching, you have a great day too.
All right. See you later.
See ya.